The bottom line of astrology is understanding and appreciating and applauding and supporting the human being. These planets are guides. Solar arc is magic, and it's been so for thousands of years. Our objective is not the multiplicity of measurements, but the assimilation of key measurements. I call them the big bells. Big time, big loud bells ring in our lives when we have solar arcs involving the sun, the moon, or an angle. The planets are guidelines to us to help us learn about life. The fear of counseling is our lack of confidence that we have anything significant to say. We must be practical more than we must be exact in order to be enrichingly engaged in the progress and development of your client. We're going to explore rectification as a process, not to be correct, but to be valid. You're close to a miracle in divining the birth time. All of this is a hunt, an exciting, challenging hunt. This is where everything you know about astrology and life, everything comes to play. You will be quite knowing about it all. And I welcome you to this circle of understanding. And we as astrologers are privileged to know how to find the portrait among the planets. Rectification. That word used to inspire fear for astrologers. It was highly technical. It didn't mean just to correct a birth time. It had the meaning of finding the right birth time. That's pretty pompous, pretty arrogant. And if we get rid of that type of thinking, we're left with logic, our own wits, perceptions, and it becomes much easier. Part of the fact of being a fearsome challenge to astrologers was that there was a dependency upon Indian astrology to bring us precise measurement capability. Things you've heard about that are just so arcane, called the prenatal epoch. This came about with arranged marriages in India, and the astrologer was part of the household practically. Well, we're going to explore how to work with rectification as a process, not to be correct. How can we possibly presume it? But to be valid, workable, helpful. Coming up with a birth time that we can test, feel comfortable with, and take with us in development into the future. Generally speaking, usually everybody has a sense of when they were born. Some family story. Well, you were born late in the evening or early in the morning, and it was very awkward for your brothers and sisters because they had to get to school on their own. And out comes a tale that is very important in the rectification process. If you pretend you're a detective, you can make it a lot of fun. If somebody says to you, well, I think I was born, I've always been told I was born late at night because my father had to go to the hospital and leave my brothers and sisters, the older brothers and sister, behind. And he had to call a neighbor to come and stay with them while he went to the hospital, because the hospital telephoned and said that my mother was about ready to give birth to me. Well, was he in bed when that call came? Why, yes, the family says he was in bed and he was aroused by that call. Well, what time did he go to bed, do you think, normally? And that type of questioning starts to zero in on a time to work with. Well, my father had to make dinner for us, and he did so late in the afternoon so he could get to the hospital on time for a birth he knew was pending. What time did he make that supper? Well, I would assume it was about 5 p.m. Again, you're zeroing in. It's a lot of fun. Boy, I could tell you stories. I remember vividly one client who was born in Indonesia, and I said, I hope very much that you know what time you were born. And she said, well, it was too dark for anybody to look at their wristwatches. I said, what does that mean? She said, well, I was born in a sewer in Jakarta, taking refuge from bombs in the Japanese occupation in the Second World War. Wow, it was so dark. I was a natural birth, and we couldn't see what time it was. Now, there are a whole lot of holes in that story, and what you do is you pursue it a little bit. Did your mother see the light of day before she got into the dark of the sewer? That kind of thing. It's fun. I keep saying that because you've got to make it a challenge, almost a sport. The objective is to narrow down the search. If somebody comes in and says to you, I have absolutely no idea what time I was born on this day. You say, are you sure of the day? Yes, I'm positive of the day. How do you know the day? Well, it's in the family Bible, but they neglected to put down the time. Now we know we have 12 signs, and we know that each sign will come over the ascendant in 2 hours or so. If we can narrow it down, the ascendant, we can narrow down the birth time possibilities to 2 hours. That we can work with. Later in this DVD, we're going to rectify the horoscope of Cleopatra of Egypt and George Washington of the good old USA. With Cleopatra, there was absolutely no idea of the date. There was a hint. And I'll show you how we can take that hint and build it into something that is a secure guideline. With George Washington, there was a record of a time around 10 o'clock in the morning, and we'll get to that later. But remember, the old astrology books, they gave you physical descriptions that became tradition for specific ascendants. The Taurus was the short, strong, bull-like body. The Gemini talked a lot and was tall and lanky. It was always late. things like that. And I think that modern astrologers should know those old traditional profiles and realize the adjustments necessary in modern times. Those adjustments come from better diet, better medicines, greater awareness of physical exercise, emphasis on looking good. They change the ascendant's image, persona projection to the world. People are being born, they're taller every day. My daughter is 6 feet tall, but so are her friends. It's fascinating. Everything has gotten bigger, stronger, people are living longer. But to know the traditions first allows us to see the departures from tradition and help us articulate the probability of a certain ascendant quite comfortably often. In European countries, the midwife is still operable in births. And there is a birth myth that is woven around the event of the birth. And that birth myth, when it's told by the midwife, is remembered by the parents. It's passed on to the child. And some of these birth myths are absolutely fantastic. They carry with them all kinds of interesting messages. There's an awful lot in between the lines. And the astrologer Christian Borup of Denmark has done extraordinary work on the birth myth. That too is fascinating learning for modern astrologers. We have to know what was tried before, what values came from old inspections and analyses, and modernize it, modernize it. If I'm in a room full of people giving a seminar, I can have all the people who have a fixed sign ascendant stand up, and it's uncanny how almost all of them will have that stolid chunkiness that we associate with Taurus, Scorpio, Aquarius, Leo. Your mind is now making adjustments to what I just said because you're trying to modernize it from your experience, and that's as it should be. But we can remember certain very interesting details of physical presentation that still endure in modern astrology. For example, the Leo hair, the hairline that is very far forward, and the hair just coming out like a lion's mane. That's how they said it years and years and years ago. The fact that the person always wants to have a suntan can be an indication toward a Leo ascendant. The hair on the person's arms or chest or shoulders or back or beard for the Scorpio is usually pronounced. And you have to be able to see that and file it away among the criteria for the ascendant profile. All of this is a hunt, an exciting, challenging hunt. even color preferences come into play, I find. I find that if I ask the person, among other questions, what is your favorite color? Very often the Taurus or the Libra emphasis on a favorite color will be turquoise. For Gemini and Aquarius, it'll be rust-colored. For Capricorn, black. Cancer, silver, blue. When you ask somebody their favorite color and they say silver, that's unusual, isn't it? So it's really leaning towards a Cancerian expression of self. I have a Cancer ascendant. 0-0, Cancer 0-4. We could very well say maybe that's wrong. Maybe it's Gemini, because I talk a lot, write a lot, I'm tall and lanky. But when you know the emotional component in my being, you can feel very strongly that it's Cancerian, the caring for others. So maybe we could say, well, you have your hat in one room and your coat in the other. But take the pressure off it. You don't want to be exact. You can't presume to be exact. Who is going to corroborate that you are exact? It has to be something that is valid, workable, helpful. And I will reiterate it the 5th time. There has to be some fun in the hunt. Very often we'll find that the ruler of an ascendant takes on the characteristics of the sign in which it is quite powerful in the horoscope. Let me explain that again. Queen Victoria, we've seen her horoscope now in several of the past DVDs, was like a bowling ball. She was barely 5 feet tall, she was round, and she could be a halfback for the Detroit Lions football team. Now, she had a Gemini ascendant, for sure. So, how do we deal with that? Her Mercury was extremely powerful. It ruled the ascendant. It was peregrine, and it was in Taurus. By far the most powerful planetary symbol guide in her horoscope. And so that Taurus part of her prevailed, and it's what she showed the world. Let's just look at a few famous ascendants. For a Capricorn ascendant, Queen Elizabeth II, as we saw in the Solar Arc DVD, the last one, Queen Elizabeth has a Capricorn ascendant. Now, Queen Elizabeth has a moon in Leo and a sun in Taurus, and they're both peregrine, and they're monarchical. But is she flamboyant? No. Is she imperturbable? Probably, but what is she really? Serious. Strongly, soberly, self-contained for administrative effectiveness. Now, do you think she has a Sagittarian ascendant? No way. Aquarius? No way. Pisces? No way. Capricorn? Aha, I can work with that. And so you fish around, and you do a trial horoscope that has like the middle of Capricorn rising. And then you use solar arcs and transits involved with the angles, as we discussed in the last DVD, and you start to zero in. When you have the same error, if you will, disparity, for certain events each time, that's telling you something. If it's a year and a half off, it might be 8 minutes off in time. But I don't worry about that when I do a rectification. I want some major angular hits. And you're going to see some with Cleopatra and George Washington that'll be very gratifying. Dustin Hoffman also has a Capricorn ascendant. You can just feel that. You get so that you feel these things rather than measure them thoroughly. Sean Connery has a Capricorn ascendant. Boy, I mean, you can just feel that, can't you? Reinhold Ebertin, the great German astrologer theorist. And just look how his work was tainted with the Second World War pathos. Right down Capricorn Alley. Sagittarius was always long, lanky, big-footed, outdoorsy. All those things are Sir Edmund Hillary, who climbed Mount Everest as the first man to do so. Nelson Mandela, who was a great sportsman, was a lawyer. Thrusts of opinion. Mandela has a Sagittarian ascendant. Dane Rudyard, the great theorist astrologer, who blended East and West. 1936, he wrote Astrology and Personality. My goodness. For an Aquarian ascendant, Carl Jung cannot be denied. The more you know about these people, the more that ascendant just shines. President Obama, Aquarian ascendant. The Libra ascendant, John F. Kennedy, Bill Clinton. Isn't it very interesting that when you have a Libra ascendant, it usually puts Aquarius on the 5th cusp and invites a lot of attention to 5th house matters. Virgo ascendants always remind me of accountants in the movies, like Peter Lorre, who had, you know, their eyes were a little extra close together, and you get that deep, penetrating stare and evaluation. How right can I make this? That's a feel you get from a Virgo ascendant. Tiger Woods has a Virgo ascendant. And the more you know about Tiger Woods, the more you know how valid that is. Warren Beatty. Madonna, who has pursued the Kabbalah and her religious studies and what have you. I mean, all these things that you don't really know about this former sex goddess are attributable to the intellectual discrimination projections of the Virgo ascendant. Mick Jagger of the Rolling Stones has several ascendants, and they're all Gemini. I mean, that is a Gemini ascendant. I mean, he has never gained an ounce of weight since he was about 11 years old. He is raw, he's moving all the time, he is frisky and driven. And when you hear him talk, the sentences roll over each other and they end up being indecisive. Well, what did he say? Now, this is an arch-emphasized Gemini ascendant. Oh, the Scorpio ascendant, remember Mussolini, Il Duce, the fascist leader of Italy in the Second World War? The pictures of him always were, you could feel it, open view of the world as his own possession, control, all of these things. That's a Scorpio ascendant, really is. You say, well, Grace Kelly had a Scorpio ascendant. Well, she did, but she had Venus as the final dispositor of her horoscope, and it was rising in the ascendant. And that ameliorates things. And I told you, the hunt can be fun, because you make these adjustments as you go along. Now, you just think about Pablo Picasso, would you please? Southern France, perpetual suntan, no hair at all, but there's your Leo ascendant. Angeline Jolie, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, is doing so much with children now. Her Cancer ascendant is showing vividly for the world to see. It wasn't always so. She was a sex pot. She was doing movies when cavorting with actors that were anything but Cancerian. But now, with a little adulthood, maturation has led her to being a nurse for children, helper of others. Oh my, can't you feel that Barbara Streisand has an Aries ascendant? I can. And always look for that pointed jaw or a remarkable nose. These things are signals of an Aries ascendant. The reddish glow in the skin and the hair. Prince Charles has a Taurus ascendant. And can't you feel how stolid and reserved he is? Ronald Reagan, making ideal, making changes, structure to preserve what is right. That's all part of Taurus archetype. With Pisces, we have Robert Redford. I remember sitting across the aisle from Robert Redford on an airplane, and I was just sort of studying him without trying to intrude. And one feels this extraordinary sensitivity about him. And he's devoted his life now to a film festival. And I mean, that's Neptune. When I got home, I started looking strongly at his horoscope, and one feels that Pisces ascendant and the state of the Neptune in the chart. Whitney Houston has a Pisces ascendant. And maybe there's a problem there with Neptune as its ruler, because she has had so many problems with drugs, etc. If your favorite color is the dark blue, it's probably Pisces ascendant. If it's red, it's probably Aries. Okay? Now these tips, some of them may sound frivolous or shallow, but tips they are. And the tip of the iceberg can lead you to the depths below. Work with it. Look at the people around you. See what you see in them in terms of their ascendant, and you will develop a feel. There's a psychodynamic registration, not just the physical. And we have to learn to appreciate that as we do our hunt. All right? Now let's hunt one down here. Let's do Cleopatra of Egypt. Now when you're doing a rectification of a historical figure, you have to make your own ephemeris for that era. And that doesn't mean an ephemeris with every day's positions of every planet. You can do it in abbreviated form, and every software on the planet today allows you to do that. What you do is you make it for 2 positions a month. So you get something that works well. And when you see it starting to click in, you can ask your computer to give you a trial chart with more detail, with all the details. So you would draw an ephemeris for Cleopatra's birth era, and then we look at the day of birth in that period and start to familiarize ourselves with probabilities and get the feel. Then we assess the reality of the person. What things pop out that are not in the ephemeris overview? They probably belong to the ascendant. The books about Cleopatra suggest for sure that she was born in 69 BC. That much we know. We know that from historical records, we know that from coinage, etc. Now remember, when you're putting a BC date into your computer, you have to put in the minus sign and 1 year afterwards. It's 69 BC in reality. You put in minus 68. Make sure you're familiar with what your computer requires in that regard. This is to take care of the fact that there's no 0 year. The greatest authorities, Egyptologists, place Cleopatra's birth at the end of minus 70 BC, or the beginning of 69 BC. Okay, we're ready. And now we have to collect some information about this woman. What was showing? What were the events that shaped her life? What was her image to the world before perhaps it was altered over all these years by history? She was born to an insecure throne. Notice those words. An insecure throne, a tottering kingdom. It was much in debt to Rome. This is because the Nile's overflowing, which brings sedimentation to the lands around the river, and therefore fertilizes crop growth, had been faulty, had been minimal, and there was few crop improvements and a decreased national product. So import-export was off. They had to borrow money from Rome. Rome ruled the world. Now, I think that this conception of being born into an insecure kingdom would undoubtedly play a great role in her need for security. She would be born with a tremendous need for security. And immediately we start to feel cancer. There is no cancer emphasis in the ephemeris for the possible dates of her birth, except one. It's very difficult in this format to show you the ephemeris page created by my computer. But when we look through this late December, January period, we find the only Cancer statement of note is the moon itself is in Cancer on January 12 and 13. Wow, that's 3 exclamation points. Okay, we file that away. Secondly, I would think that a great international overview would be essential for Cleopatra. Remember, this is a big kingdom. It's in the middle of trade routes. She's a woman. She had to work 10 times as hard for people to be proud, for her country to glow and grow. Plus, it was complicated by Rome. Rome could not stand Cleopatra, even before she became queen. She was a woman. She was Greek. And so all the pundits of the day, all the poets of the day, all the writers and everybody from Rome vilified her severely. She was fighting a big battle. She had to be aware of these things internationally. Now, many sources record that Cleopatra was skilled in languages. She spoke Egyptian. She was the only leader of government, the only king or queen to speak the language of the people of Egypt. It all began when Alexander the Great conquered Alexandria and named it for himself. And then, as he did many places, and then he died at a very young age. First great man in history, really. And his top general was named Ptolemy, which in Greek is like Smith or Jones. And he took over Egypt. And he started to build himself pharaonically. And all the people who came afterward in this line followed suit. But Cleopatra made an effort to get to the people. She had to. She spoke Egyptian, Ethiopian, Troglodyte, I don't know what that is, Hebrew, Aramaic, Syriac, Median, and Parthian. Parthian is what we call Iraq and Iran today. So the 3rd and 9th axis seems to me to be prominent. What a deduction. The Cancerian moon, the 3rd and 9th axis, we file that away. All sources talk also about her beautiful voice. I kid you not. This is a very important consideration. You could very well say that I have a dramatic sounding voice, almost heroic sometimes. Well, that's because I was an opera singer for 26 years and I was trained to do that. And my voice can do many things. And I have the moon in Leo in the 3rd house. Simple deductions like that can bring rectification processes to life. But isn't a beautiful voice also a 3rd house reference? So we have another 3rd house reference that must be clear as we assemble Cleopatra's horoscope. Cleopatra identified with sacred ritual and theological self-animation. They all did. They said, I am a god, or I am a goddess, and I am descended from the great gods. She portrayed herself as Isis, the mother archetype. That's even more Cancer. And dare we add Scorpio for the emphasis on ritual. This is a big part of her life. She is constantly referred to in history in the same breath with pearls. Out of an oyster, pearls. Continuously. And pearls are represented by the moon. Pearls are everywhere. Now, she had a boundless imagination for pageantry and lethal subtlety. When she invited Mark Antony to their first banquet meeting and tryst, God, you can't imagine what she did. She she took over these big marble halls with tables festooned with golden goblets that the guests would automatically take home. And she had rose petals carpeting the floors to the height of her knees. It goes on and on, friends. So we have this great, great fantasy and projection. Might this be an inflated Neptune? I mean, it's bigger than any movie could do. There's more, but we've made our point. Now, back to that ephemeris that we've made. The ephemeris shows that the sun was in Capricorn on the day that the moon was in Cancer. Gosh, isn't that wonderful? Can't you feel this moon in Cancer, Capricornian monarch, overcompensating 1,000 ways for being a woman? Can you feel that 3rd and 9th force of the state of mind? Can you smell the pageantry about her? Yeah, pronounced need for security and the pearl-covered mother goddess. There we have it. Saturn, on that day, was opposing the moon. This would be the pervasive father. In dealing with monarchs in succession, you often see that. Queen Elizabeth II has Saturn retrograde on her midheaven. That's her father. And you can go back ruler to ruler to ruler in a bloodline and see this very, very ubiquitous statement by Saturn. There's a seriousness of purpose, a mature, determined approach to things. Then there was the nose. Cleopatra was famous for being beguiling. It's Hollywood that has made her famous for sensuality. The coins showed profiles of monarchs. And here we saw this tremendous nose for her father and for herself. So she was not really a beautiful, sensual, silken lady. She was a captivating woman who knew exactly what she was doing in many languages. Now, when we emphasize the 3rd and 9th axis in a trial horoscope or two, lo and behold, we get a Scorpio ascendant. A Scorpio ascendant. And I personally have lived with this horoscope for a long time. And I can see that hairline. I can see the heaviness of her hair. I can feel the control of her personality. And boy, did she. And we look at a trial horoscope, and there it all is. Let me show you. Here is Cleopatra's horoscope after a lot of trials and tests, and we're going to go through 3 of those tests in a moment to prove this wonderful horoscope. Here is the ascendant at 13 Scorpio, okay? Notice that Pluto and Uranus are in conjunction and quindicile to that ascendant. That's very powerful stuff. Really strong. Just feel that. And at the same time, we have the Capricorn sun that is peregrine, oppose the moon in Cancer, that's the reigning need, final dispositor, secure my country, and en route, please give me some emotional satisfaction. And of course, much of her life had to do with children. A little bit about that in a moment. Notice this Saturn here. It's 00 Aquarius. Today, even, automatically, when you see Saturn in Aquarius, you have to think of benefiting the people. Community service. Saturn by solar arc, DVD 4. Age 18, Saturn equals midheaven. File that away. You know she probably took over the country at age 18. Look at this 3rd, 9th axis. The moon rules it, the 9th house. Saturn rules the 3rd. The sun is there, peregrine, making a tremendous statement. Look at the Mercury, which is also peregrine. Look at the language emphasis. It's all there. And isn't it lovely to see that the Neptune factor here is trine to Venus? See that? Both air signs within orb. Immediate recognition of the trine. Venus being angular is strong. And you can go on and on and on. But I think we have something here. It fits all that we know about Cleopatra. Now let's take it and adjust it to events in time and see if it holds up with arcs and transits to the angles. Now this is when she took over the country, the kingdom. Her father died. Notice that Saturn now has advanced in this double ring solar arc chart to exact position on the IC-MC axis. Look where the moon is, almost exactly on the midheaven, the solar arc moon. I mean, it's extremely powerful. Notice how the ascendant has come forward by solar arc right into the grips of that extraordinary upheaval and power projection to the public, the natal Pluto-Uranus conjunction. Notice how that is on her Neptune. Solar arc Uranus Pluto equals Neptune. This is her feeling of being a goddess. That was very real in those days. Now, the Egyptians didn't want a woman to run the country, so they insisted to have a male. So she was made ruler of the country, queen of the country, along with her brother, who was aged 10. Notice how this Saturn rules the third house, her brother. Now, I'm not going to get into all the catalog of historical events in this medium, but there was a lot of slaughter going on behind the scenes later on as she wielded her way, and behind the scenes there were divisions in camps supporting Cleopatra and supporting this young brother, because this young brother allowed the high priest to take over because he couldn't do anything. All right, it's a fascinating story. I go on and on. We should write a play for Hollywood that is accurate rather than swooningly sensual. All right, let's go on a little further here. This is when Julius Caesar came to Alexandria, which is underwater now, you know, in the northern part of Egypt, right off the coast, and they're slowly discovering it underneath the waters. It was a huge harbor, and you can just picture that grand lighthouse, and you can see Julius Caesar coming to Egypt down from Rome to collect some money, the debt. So she had to use her ways to beguile him into patience. All sorts of stories that she had herself delivered into his presence, wrapped in a rug, a carpet. I don't know about that. You can't find that in the horoscope. But look what we do find. This is a big, important meeting. Notice how solar arc moon has come up here just past the midheaven and come down here to equal Venus. Notice how the sun has arced forward to equal the ascendant. This is terribly critical in testing our birth time. Notice that the secondary progressed moon was at 13 Taurus, precisely on the 7th house of relationships. Ha ha. Boy, when you're rectifying a horoscope and this kind of thing happens, you just feel so good. I mean, it means you're close to a miracle in divining the birth time. This next chart, test, is her death. She has a meal, and at about, I think, 10 after 10 at night, probably. And I've gotten deeply into this. That's when I think it took place. She committed suicide with poison. Now Hollywood tells us that she took a snake, a deadly snake, and put it to her breast, etc. Well, I don't think so. And I've conferred with some real scholars on this subject, and they agreed it was probably just poison, because Cleopatra was the head of a college of perfumes for women, how to make them, pharmaceuticals, including poison. And I would think that every monarch of those dangerous times would have a little vial just in case anything went wrong, throw it down, just the way they did in Nuremberg, in the trials after the Second World War. Let's look at her suicide in relation to her birth chart. As soon as I said poison, did you think of Neptune? Notice that solar arc Neptune has come to her moon. Notice how solar arc Mars, in the last 4 years, you see, 13 Scorpio ascendant, 17 Scorpio at this moment of suicide. She has had 4 to 7 very powerful, bombastic years. Fighting, fleeing, not good. But when that sun, that solar arc Mars came exactly to our rectified midheaven, it was the ultimate. The solar arc sun that we saw making a few stops here is now square to that very powerful setup in her natal 7th. The secondary progressed moon position was precisely on her sun. This proves it. It tells us that she took her own life with poison. And the Queen of Kings entered history as a complicated, beguiling siren. Now, you're not going to have Cleopatra come into your office to do her horoscope, but the process is the same with everybody. Very often when a horoscope records a time, it is quite reliable. Of course, your antennae go up and say, well, how many people are born at 6 o'clock or noontime or an even hour? And what you need to do is maybe a small adjustment. And we're going to see a small adjustment now when we look at George Washington's horoscope. But small adjustment or big adjustment or colossal, deduction, as we did with Cleopatra, out of nothing, practically. It is a challenge. It's a challenge to our art. This is where everything you know about astrology and life, where everything comes to play. Practice it. You develop a feel for it. Now, I know there's some measurement purists who will probably object that I say something like that. Well, I'm an artist analyst, and I work with feel. I know how to measure, and I try to get them together in a practical way. As soon as somebody walks into my office, and I know we're going to be talking rectification, I look at absolutely everything. And it's instinctive. I can see it. The power of observation can really be practiced anywhere. You can sit on an airplane after a full flight of discussion with a businessman, for example, and feel his style. Feel his emotional reaction to decisions he is making. You know where the transits are in relation to the birth date he gives you. You notice that he has a brilliant red tie on, but he's a Pisces. Now that's something so simple. But if there's been all kinds of aggressive talk in his telling you stories about his life as you're on your second glass of wine, and you see that red tie, there's a clash there. But you know he probably was born between 8 and 6 in the morning. A 12th house Piscean sun with an Aries ascendant. If that Pisces ascendant has Aries intercepted in the first house, which is very often seen in our European and United States latitudes, it's like a red-hot poker put into steam, into ice water, and you get steam. That's a nice image. Create images like that for yourself, and you will feel those things. You felt it earlier when I referred to the Libra ascendant, Bill Clinton, John F. Kennedy, usually putting Aquarius on the 5th. There's something slick about ego projection through 5th house experiences. All right. It goes on, and it's fascinating, and try to make fun with it. I want to talk now about George Washington, not as extensively as we did about Cleopatra, but instructively as well. George Washington's birth time is suggested in a historical book kept at Mount Vernon. He was not born in Mount Vernon. He became the head of Mount Vernon estate plantation when he married his wife Martha, who had inherited Mount Vernon from her husband before. Okay, the book says around 10 o'clock in the morning. That's not good enough for us. What we have to do is put little adjustments to it and test them, just as we did with Cleopatra. First of all, George Washington was taller than most people, conspicuously taller. Again, he wasn't conspicuously as tall as Hollywood would make him, but he was conspicuously taller in reality, as history shows, as commentary shows, when you read about what people thought when they saw him walk into a room. He was probably about 6'3" or 4", but certainly not 6'10". He was lean. He was an outdoorsman. He possessed extreme physical strength, well annotated. He was as strong as a bull. He would break up fights between slaves with just forcibly with one hand throwing one person to the ground and separating him from another. And you didn't mess with George. George was very, very powerful. Strangely, he had a very weak voice. This is described by many, many historians. It comes from many letters. He corresponded copiously. But you could hardly hear him give his inaugural address. They didn't have microphones, of course, etc. But he spoke very quietly. And it became part of his power. People would strain to hear him. And he meant business, and he was brilliantly intelligent. Now, all of this says to me, an ascendant that is Gemini or Sagittarius. But around 10 o'clock, the ascendant would have been Taurus. Now here's one of those exceptions that can unnerve you, which we saw with Queen Victoria. But notice where Venus, the ruler of the ascendant, is. That Venus is in conjunction with Saturn. Very, very strong situation here. That Venus is on the Aries point, 29 Pisces, but basically 0, Aries. 29 mutable to 2 cardinal areas at each cardinal sign are called Aries points. We've covered that, but I want you to remind yourself of it. These things are what are brought forward for people to see. He was austere to a fault. He was sartorially splendid, had his clothes made to measurements that he sent to London, and everything was blue and tan and gold. He was severe and constantly worried about financial success on his plantation. This starts to show us that the Saturn-Venus ruler of the ascendant signature was George Washington's identity. He was shy, he was withdrawn, he was deeply pensive. He feared public speaking because he knew he couldn't be heard. And another reason is that his teeth were totally shot. And you've heard about the wooden false teeth supposedly on display in the Smithsonian. Well, they're not wood. They tried to use ivory. Slaves used to take their teeth out and sell them. And then French dentists would come over with sophisticated implant techniques, and masters of slaves were walking around with their teeth in their mouths. Interesting, isn't it? Well, it's a little off the point, but he was fearful of public speaking. He was obsessively punctual. I mean obsessively punctual. Notice Saturn, Venus, Saturn, Venus, Saturn, Venus, with every one of these epithets. He was unemotional in his communications. Well, that had a lot to do with the style of letter writing of the day. His sentences were very long, but they were unemotional. They had circuitous language to them. It's as if everything was depressed by Saturn, everything that was emotional, because Saturn was with Venus. And again, these lifelong problems with his teeth. At the end of his life, he wrote a poignant letter to his French dentist, and they wrote in code, because Washington knew his mail was always being opened at the post office by other people to find out what was going on in the world of politics. And he was so embarrassed by this. So you can see him very, very tightly like this entering a room. The women adored him because of his power and his height, you know. And he adored the ladies too. And in letters, diary, he would write how many intriguing ladies were at this dinner or this dance. Imagine, he would count them. This is sort of a vicarious enjoyment, you know, once removed, and it does ring of Saturn, Venus again. At the end of his life, he had to become deaf. And deafness is Saturn, and often aligned with Venus. So I've justified the fact that he has a Taurus ascendant, and Venus is highly jeopardized through its conjunction with Saturn. Let's take another look. Mars is peregrine on the descendant. This tells us about an all-consuming military career. Talk about Mars and Scorpio. Control. This was George Washington. Brave to beat the band. Early in his military career, when the British were still over here, leading a newly forming colonists' army, militia, he would go out to the plains in the west and fight the Indians and annex land. And he was totally fearless. And there are many, many reports of soldiers around him saying how their leader on his big white horse would go out there and all these bullets would just go right by him. He had no fear whatsoever. He was young and he was totally critical of the British senior officers who paraded around as if they ruled the world. And he was frustrated beyond belief to get an officer's commission. That becomes very important because the opportunity came when he was made head of the army to fight the British. All right. Washington's relationship with his mother is one that we have to note. while we have Venus square to the node, it doesn't really prevail here. They had a terrible, terrible time together. What dominates is the Pluto square to the moon. That's a mother situation in anybody's horoscope. She never said one kind word to George in his entire life. Never a thank you, nothing. He tolerated her, and she was kept out of the way. She was eccentric. Look at the Uranus, ruler of the sun, Uranus square to the sun, ruler of the fourth. There are three things here that talk about mother. Two of them are egregious. Washington constantly needed to make things happen. And here you find the reigning need of the moon in Capricorn. He had an international purview. You see this very clearly with Saturn, ruler of the ninth, on Venus, ruler of the ascendant. We've talked about that. We see the arch perspective of Pluto squaring the moon in Capricorn, in the ninth. You're getting the feel of the horoscope without any doubt. He was sensitive, subtle, adamant, and powerful. Quite a combination. Now, George Washington became such a hero that when people learned that he was coming to town down the Potomac River in a barge from Mount Vernon in Virginia, right across the river, 20,000 people would suddenly appear, screaming praises to their hero. I'm no historian, but I've picked out certain dates that are key to George Washington's development, and let's see what the astrology says for our rectified horoscope. Now, in 1775, he became commander-in-chief of the Army of the Colonies, something he desperately desired for many years leading up to it. And what do we see? Jupiter exactly by solar arc equaling ascendant-descendant axis. At the same time that transiting Jupiter and transiting Uranus over here were square to the sun. That's a very powerful hit. This is when the colonists decided they could not put up anymore with British intrusion and rule. But they had to have an organized force to fight back. And Washington desperately wanted to run that force. And he was voted to be that leader. That horoscope shows this perfectly. The reward mechanism of Jupiter equals ascendant, right there with Mars peregrine in Scorpio, accompanied by trigger transits that were very powerful. The war was a terrible, terrible affair. The war was simply hard to imagine because it was waged really without any kind of substantial budget. Our founding fathers in Philadelphia just couldn't get the money together. And yet he could inspire the people to loyalty. And there was finally a victory at Yorktown and peace. When that happened, in April 18, 1783, solar arc Uranus was exactly on George Washington, the commander-in-chief's midheaven. transiting Jupiter was there as well. And that Venus-Saturn signature, natally, had advanced to precisely the ascendant. Isn't that something? Isn't that something? Look at that drama of development. Oh, gosh, look at that. Exactly. Peace and victory. I feel that we know what time he was born. Precisely at 10:05 in the morning. Around 10 o'clock? Well, this adjustment makes a lot of difference. A little bit later, the United States of America, newly independent, is setting up a presidency position to lead the nation, and George Washington, who by that time was a saint, with so many people constantly adoring and applauding him, it's hard to believe, much more than a rock star today, much more than a soccer star in England or Argentina or Brazil. This was big. And the descriptions of it are extraordinary. And George Washington played into it very subtly. He would show up with a yellow carriage drawn by 6 white horses. Now think about that. Isn't this overcompensatory for his withdrawn nature? His dour austerity? Yeah. Fascinating story. You should read a biography of George Washington. You'll know exactly how thrilling this is to capture it astrologically, page after page after page. Here is his inauguration as first president of the United States. There had been a tremendous movement to make him a king. But he said, we just defeated a king in England. We don't want a king. And he was very soft-spoken, but powerfully spoken. And when he said something, it went. And everybody froze into silence to listen. Here is his inauguration. Notice that the sun advanced by arc to 29 degrees and 55 minutes of Aries, which is basically 0 Taurus in 5 minutes of arc, precisely square our rectified midheaven. Isn't that marvelous? Sun equals midheaven. And as we learned on DVD 4 about solar arcs, you can't do better than sun equals midheaven. There it is. As well, the solar arc position of the ascendant played exactly into awareness of his moon in Capricorn. Holy smokes. And would you believe the trigger transit for all of this was transiting Uranus on the 4th cusp? I could rest my case right there. But let's go once more into the future. George retired. There was a second term as president, but soon over. He got sick, and he died with a throat problem. Remember Saturn with Venus, and Venus rules the throat in Taurus, ascendant? Notice that Venus has come down here with Saturn, of course, in solar arc, to opposition with Uranus, ruler of his midheaven, his status in life. Notice at the midheaven that his famous peregrine Mars in Scorpio has risen to exact conjunction with the midheaven. Dare I say the trigger transit of transiting Mars exactly conjunct his natal Mars ended the story of George Washington. It's very emotional to get involved with the astrology of such epic people and world experiences. And this is how you learn nuance, courage, and strategy to help people, normal people, who need an adjustment on their birth time so that their horoscope can be practical and helpful and follow them into the future. Two things to remember here, especially, is that rectification works to please the astrologer. You don't know if it's right, but boy, you feel good when you sense that it is. There's nothing wrong with that if we keep our perspective intact. Second, God is not sitting there using a stopwatch when you're born. Just isn't. There is leeway. There is gradualism in creation and development. And we as astrologers are privileged to know how to work within gradual time development to find the portrait among the planets. Enjoy it.